The first time Eliza Caldwell walked into the general store in Harrow Creek, Texas, with a stack of novels tucked under her arm and a copy of Jane Austen pressed to her chest like armor, every man in the room went quiet, not because she was beautiful, though she was, but because nobody in that sun-baked town had ever seen a woman walk anywhere like she owned the ground beneath her boots. It was the spring of 1878, and Harrow Creek sat stubborn and small on the western edge of the Texas Hill Country, the kind of town that had grown up fast around a cattle trail and hadn't quite figured out what it wanted to be when it grew up. There was a saloon, a livery stable, a church that doubled as a schoolhouse on weekdays, Doc Hennessy's office, and Me Briggs's general store, which sold everything from flour and ammunition to the occasional bolt of calico that came in on the monthly supply wagon. It was not a town with a library. It was not a town that had ever thought it needed one. Eliza had arrived 2 weeks prior from San Antonio, where her father, a schoolteacher named Gerald Caldwell, had died of a fever and left her with a modest inheritance, a house that needed to be sold to cover his debts, and a trunk full of books that she refused to part with under any circumstances. She had taken a position as the new schoolteacher, hired via letter by the town council of Harrow Creek, who had been desperate enough after losing their previous teacher to influenza that they had not bothered asking whether the applicant was a man or a woman. By the time they realized their mistake, Eliza had already arrived on the stagecoach with her trunk of books and a letter of appointment that was entirely legal. The town council, composed of 3 ranchers and the owner of the saloon, had stood on the porch of the general store with expressions ranging from annoyed to baffled, and Eliza had smiled pleasantly at all of them and asked where the schoolhouse was. After a long silence, the council chairman, a barrel-chested man named Amos Greer, had pointed east and said nothing further. Eliza had thanked him and walked in that direction, and the town had been arguing about her ever since. The Calloway brothers were the ones who said it loudest. There were 3 of them, Hank, Boyd, and Reuben Calloway, sons of the late Franklin Calloway, who had built the largest cattle operation in the county before his heart gave out 2 winters back. Hank, the eldest at 32, now ran the Calloway Ranch with a kind of relentless efficiency that left little room for anything he considered frivolous. Boyd, 28, was loud and opinionated and spent too much time at the saloon for his own good. And then there was Reuben. Reuben Calloway was 26 years old, 6 feet of lean muscle and quiet determination, with dark hair that curled a little at the temples when he'd been working in the heat, and gray eyes the color of the sky just before a thunderstorm. He was known in Harrow Creek as the best horseman in 3 counties, a man who could read the land like a map and coax cattle across rocky terrain that would have broken another rancher. He was also known for saying very little, which his brothers took as agreement when it wasn't, and which the rest of the town mistook for severity when it was actually something much closer to thoughtfulness. It was Boyd who first said it, leaning against the fence post outside the general store on a warm Tuesday morning, while Reuben was loading sacks of feed into the wagon. Eliza had just passed by on her way to the schoolhouse, 3 books balanced in the crook of her arm, one of them thick enough to use as a doorstop. "She reads too many books," Boyd announced to no one in particular, watching her go. "That woman's going to fill her head so full of stories she won't have room for any practical sense." Hank, sitting on the buckboard, grunted in agreement. "Woman like that ought to be minding a household, not filling children's heads with poetry and such." Reuben did not say anything. He lifted the last sack of feed, settled it in the wagon, and looked after Eliza Caldwell as she turned the corner toward the schoolhouse. There was something in the way she walked, purposeful, unhurried, as if she were carrying something precious and knew it, that he found he could not look away from easily. "You listening, Rue?" Boyd called. "I'm listening," Reuben said, and climbed up onto the buckboard. He did not say he agreed. The first time he actually spoke to Eliza was 3 days later, and it happened entirely by accident, Or at least, it would have taken a very determined man to argue otherwise, and Reuben was not the arguing kind. He had come into the general store in the afternoon to pick up a parcel of wire fencing, and Eliza was there at the counter speaking with me Briggs in an animated, warm voice about whether the supply wagon might be persuaded to bring books as part of its regular cargo. Me, who was a practical woman with a good heart, was saying that she didn't see why not if someone was paying for them, and Eliza was saying she fully intended to pay for them herself, and they were deep in the pleasant logistics of it when Reuben came through the door. He stopped just inside the doorway because Eliza had set 3 books on the counter and was pointing at them as she made her argument, and the gesture was so full of enthusiasm, her hands moving, her brown eyes bright, her dark hair coming slightly loose from its pins, that he felt oddly like he had walked into the middle of something important without an invitation. Me noticed him. "Mr. Calloway. Your parcel's in the back, I'll just fetch it," which left Reuben standing a few feet from Eliza Caldwell, who turned and looked at him with frank, curious eyes. "You're one of the Calloway brothers," she said. It was not a question. "Reuben," he said. "Eliza Caldwell." She extended her hand the way a businesswoman might, direct and without hesitation, and after only the briefest pause he shook it. Her grip was firm. "I'm the new schoolteacher." "I know," he said. She seemed to find that faintly amusing. "And what do you think of that, Mr. Calloway? I've heard a range of opinions from your family already." He looked at her steadily. "I think the children need a teacher." "That's a refreshingly practical position," she said, and there was something warm in her voice that had not been there a moment ago. She turned back to her books, straightening the stack with careful hands. "Do you read?" "When I get the chance." "And what do you read?" He thought about it honestly. "Trail guides, the almanac, whatever newspapers come through." "Useful things," she said, nodding seriously, as if she were genuinely considering this rather than dismissing it, and something about that made him stand up a little straighter. "What about you?" he asked, surprising himself. He was not typically a man who kept conversations going. She smiled. It was a real smile, not the polite one she gave the town council. "Everything I can get my hands on," she said. "History, natural philosophy, fiction, poetry. Letters from people long dead who had fascinating things to say." She patted the top book gently. "There's an entire world in books, Mr. Calloway. Several worlds, actually." Me came back with his parcel, and the moment dissolved, and Reuben paid for his wire and left. But he found himself thinking about what she had said, several worlds, actually, for the rest of the day and into the evening while he was doing the rounds of the south pasture, until the sky went deep blue, and the stars came out enormous over the flat Texas land. Several worlds. He had never thought about it quite like that. Over the next few weeks, Reuben found himself in the general store with a frequency that me Briggs found slightly suspicious, and his brothers found entirely uninteresting, because the idea that Reuben might be stopping in to talk to the schoolteacher did not cross their minds as a possibility. Eliza was almost always there in the late afternoon, either talking to me about her book order or sitting at the small table near the window, grading her students' work with a cup of tea that me indulged her with. They talked the way 2 people talk when they're both a little surprised to find themselves talking, carefully at first, then with increasing ease, as though some internal door were being opened a crack wider each time. She told him about her father, who had been the kind of teacher who believed that learning was the most democratic gift a society could offer its people, and about growing up in San Antonio among stacks of books and long evenings of reading aloud. He told her about the land, about the way the cattle moved before a storm and what the grass looked like when it needed water, about his father, who had been a hard man but a fair one, and who had taught all 3 of his sons to read and keep accounts, believing that a rancher who couldn't read his own contracts was a rancher who would eventually be swindled. "He sounds like he was a good man," Eliza said one afternoon, looking up from the composition she'd been marking. "He was a complicated man," Reuben said honestly. "Good in some ways, difficult in others, like most people." She looked at him for a moment with those direct brown eyes and said, "That's a very wise thing to say." He felt heat at the back of his neck that had nothing to do with the Texas afternoon. "I just try to see things plain," he said. "That's rarer than you'd think," she said softly, and went back to her marking. Boyd was the one who noticed first, which surprised Reuben because Boyd typically noticed very little that didn't directly affect him. It was a Friday evening at the supper table in the Calloway ranch house, a long, solid table that their mother had brought from Tennessee before she died, and their housekeeper, a capable widow named Clara, had set out a good meal of beef stew and corn bread. The three brothers sat where they always sat, Hank at the head, Boyd across from Reuben, the chair at the foot of the table left empty, because none of them had ever been willing to take it after their father died. "You've been going into town a lot," Boyd said, pointing his fork at Reuben with the casual authority of a man who has no awareness that this is rude. "I've had things to pick up," Reuben said. "Me Briggs told Tom Greer that you've been sitting with the schoolteacher," Boyd said. "Talking." Reuben buttered his corn bread and said nothing. "She reads too many books," Boyd said again, for what Reuben estimated was the 7th or 8th time since Eliza Caldwell had arrived in Harrow Creek. "A woman like that has no practicality. Her head's full of fancy ideas and no common sense." "That's not true," Reuben said, quietly and without heat. Boyd blinked. Hank set down his spoon. "You haven't spent 5 minutes with her," Reuben continued, still looking at his plate. "She runs a classroom of 14 children across 3 different age groups. She's organized the lending of books so that 3 families who couldn't afford them can read to their children at night. She rides from the boarding house to the schoolhouse in all weathers and she hasn't complained once. That's not a woman without practicality." There was a silence around the table that was heavier than the usual kind. "She's still not appropriate company for you," Hank said at last in his slow, deliberate way. "She's the schoolteacher. People will talk." "People already talk," Reuben said. "That's what people do." He ate the rest of his supper without saying anything further, and afterward he went out to the porch and stood in the warm spring dark and thought about the fact that he had just defended Eliza Caldwell at his own dinner table, and that it had felt, without any hesitation or complication, like the most natural thing in the world. He had been building something in his mind for weeks, an idea that had started as a vague shape and was slowly becoming clearer. He had not spoken it aloud yet because it seemed enormous and perhaps ridiculous, but it kept returning to him when he was working, persistent as a current beneath the surface of a river. Eliza had told him the previous week that the hardest part of her life in Harrow Creek was not the skeptical town council or the long ride to school or even the children who came in hungry and couldn't think for hunger. The hardest part was the books. She had brought 3 trunks of them from San Antonio, and she had already lent most of them out, and the supply wagon could only bring a few new ones every month, and the children were beginning to outpace what she had. She wanted more than anything to have enough books that any child in Harrow Creek who wanted to read could walk into a place and find something. Not a shelf in a corner of the general store, a real place, a library. "That seems like a lot to hope for in a town this size," Reuben had said, not unkindly. "Most things worth hoping for seem like a lot at first," she had said. He thought about that now, standing in the dark with the spring wind moving through the live oaks at the edge of the yard. He thought about the old stone building at the back of the Calloway property, near the creek, a building his father had put up years ago intending it for a second bunkhouse, and then never finished, because a second bunkhouse had stopped being necessary after 2 of the hands moved on. It had 4 solid walls and a roof that needed patching and a plank floor that needed sanding and windows on 3 sides. It was about the size of a generous parlor. It was, if you looked at it right, exactly the size of a small library. Reuben went to bed and lay awake for a long time, and the next morning he went out to the old stone building and walked around it slowly, thinking. He was not a man who made decisions quickly. He made them carefully, and then, once made, He committed to them with the kind of steadiness that had carried him through droughts and cattle losses and the long grief of his father's death. When he had decided something, it was decided. By the time he had walked around the building twice, he had decided this. He did not tell his brothers because he already knew what they would say. Instead, he started quietly. He spent his evenings that first week cleaning out the building, years of dust and old equipment, and a family of raccoons that had taken up residence in the back corner. He patched the roof himself on a Saturday, up on the ladder with tar paper and good nails, watching the creek glitter below through the trees. He sanded the floor over the following week, working by lantern light after the regular ranch work was done, the rasp of the sandpaper rhythmic and satisfying in the quiet. He ordered lumber from the sawmill in the next town over, arriving on a Tuesday with his wagon, and came back with enough good planed wood to build shelves. He had never built shelves before, but he had built fences and corrals and the better part of the south barn, and shelves seemed to him a less complicated structural problem. He spent 2 weekends measuring and cutting and fitting, and by the end of the second weekend, the stone building had walls lined with deep, solid shelves that ran from knee height to well above his head, built in sections with space enough between them to walk through, and a reading table in the center made from a single wide plank of cedar that he smoothed until it was like glass. He wrote a letter to a book supplier in Austin he had found advertised in a newspaper, and then, because he was not sure that was enough, he wrote to another one in San Antonio. He described what he was building and asked for a catalog of titles. He received the catalogs within 3 weeks and spent several evenings going through them with the kind of careful attention he usually reserved for livestock records, noting prices and quantities, setting aside enough money from his own savings to place a substantial first order. He wrote to Eliza's father's name, hoping to find who might have had Gerald Caldwell's book connections, and discovered through a carefully worded inquiry to the San Antonio School Board that Gerald Caldwell had donated a portion of his private library to the school there before his death, but that there were still boxes of unclaimed volumes at his old address. Reuben wrote to the landlord of that address, explained what he was building, and offered to pay for the shipping of whatever remained. He did all of this in a methodical, quiet way, in the margins of his regular life, and he did not tell anyone until the evening he went to find Eliza at the boarding house where she rented a room from Mrs. Fletcher, and asked if she would take a walk with him. She came to the door with a book in her hand. She was always reading, and when she saw his expression, she marked her page carefully and set the book on the hall table and said, "All right." They walked in the blue spring dusk, past the edge of town and along the creek trail, and he was quiet so long that she finally said, "Reuben, whatever it is, you can say it." He stopped walking and looked at her in the fading light. She was wearing her plain dark dress, the practical one she wore to school, and her hair was slightly loose from its pins the way it always was by evening, and she was looking up at him with those steady, open eyes. "I've been building something," he said. "On the ranch property, near the creek. I'd like you to come and see it." She looked at him for a moment. "What have you been building?" "A library," he said, and then added, because it seemed important to say the whole thing, "for you, and for the children. And for anyone in Harrow Creek who wants to read." The silence that followed was the kind that comes after something unexpected has been said, and the person hearing it needs a moment to understand that it is real. Eliza Caldwell had heard a great many things said to her in her life, some kind, some unkind, some entirely confusing, but she had never heard anything quite like this. "Reuben," she said carefully, "you've been building an actual library." "Yes," he said, with shelves and a reading table. "I've ordered books from Austin and San Antonio. They should arrive next month." He paused. "And I wrote about your father's books, the ones left in San Antonio." The landlord wrote back, "There are 6 boxes. They're being shipped." She stared at him. Her hand had come up to her chest the way it did when she was trying to keep herself from feeling something too loudly. "My father's books." "Yes, you found my father's books. "What remained of them?" he said quietly. "They seemed like they ought to be here." Eliza Caldwell, who had grown up the daughter of a schoolteacher, who had learned from her father that feeling things deeply was nothing to be ashamed of, who had never in her 23 years been the kind of woman who cried quietly into a handkerchief, because that seemed to her a waste of good crying time. Eliza pressed her fingers over her mouth and cried directly, not loudly but with her whole self, the way a person cries when something they had not known they were waiting for has finally arrived. Reuben did not back away from it. He was not a man who was frightened of strong feeling. He stood quietly and let her cry, and after a moment, without entirely deciding to do so, he put his hand gently against her shoulder, and she turned toward him the way a person turns toward warmth, and cried a little more with her forehead briefly against his chest. "Sorry," she said after a moment, stepping back, pressing her fingers beneath her eyes. "Don't be," he said simply. She looked up at him and something shifted between them, not dramatically, not with any sudden declaration, but the way the light changes in the morning when the sun clears the horizon, a slow and irreversible brightening. "Can I see it?" she asked. "The library. That's why I came to find you," he said. They walked together in the dusk along the creek trail, and the fireflies were beginning to come out in the long grass. And when Reuben pushed open the door of the stone building and lit the lantern inside, Eliza stood in the doorway and looked at the shelves, solid and straight and deep and smelling of fresh cedar and new wood. And then she walked in slowly the way a person walks into a church, touching the shelves with her fingertips, running her hand along the smooth reading table. "This is real," she said, half to herself. "It is," he said. She turned and looked at him across the warm lantern light, and he was standing near the door with his hat in his hands the way he always stood when he was uncertain, turning it slowly by the brim. She had noticed that about him weeks ago, the hat, the slow turning, the thing he did when he felt exposed. "Why?" she asked. It was a real question, not a rhetorical one. She genuinely wanted to know. He thought about that for a moment, being honest with himself before he answered her. "Because you said there ought to be one," he said at last, "and you were right. And because someone should have done it before now and no one did," he paused, "and because I wanted to." "Because you wanted to," she repeated softly. "Yes." She came across the room toward him slowly, and when she stopped she was close enough that he could see the reflection of the lantern light in her eyes. "Reuben Calloway," she said, "you are not at all what I expected when I came to Harrow Creek." "I'm not sure what you expected," he said. "Something a great deal simpler," she said honestly, and there was warmth in her voice and something more than warmth, something that made him stand very still. He wanted to say something. There were several things in him that wanted saying, things that had been accumulating over weeks of afternoons in the general store and evenings talking beside the creek and long days on the ranch when he thought about what she'd said about the several worlds inside books. But he was not, as has been established, a man who said things quickly or without being sure of them first. "I should take you back to town," he said instead. "It's getting dark." She smiled, not the polite smile, the real one, and said, "All right." They walked back along the creek in the full dark, with the stars enormous above them and the fireflies doing their slow electric dance in the grass, and their hands were close enough that once, on a rougher piece of trail, his steadied her elbow, and neither of them mentioned it. The books from Austin arrived on a Monday in mid-May, packed in 2 large crates, 47 volumes of history, natural science, geography, poetry, and fiction, including a complete set of the Bronte novels and a copy of the collected works of Tennyson, and 3 books on American history that Eliza had specifically requested for her students. The books from San Antonio arrived Thursday of the same week, the 6 boxes from her father's house, wrapped in brown paper and smelling faintly of the study she had grown up in. And when she opened the first box and found her father's handwriting on the inside cover of the top book, she had to stop and put her hand flat on the table and breathe for a moment. Reuben had come to help unpack because moving 6 boxes of books from a wagon was not a one-woman task, and he carried them from the wagon to the stone building with the same steady competence he applied to everything physical. And when he came in from the last trip and saw her standing with her hand on the table and her head bowed, he set down the box and waited. "He wrote in all his books," she said after a moment. "His name on the inside cover and sometimes a note about when he bought it. There's one here he bought the year I was born." She turned it over in her hands. "I thought these were lost." "They weren't," Reuben said. She looked up at him. There was nothing particularly complex about that statement. It was a simple fact, but there was a kindness in it that felt, to Eliza, like the whole weight of what he had done being spoken plainly. "Thank you," she said, and she put the book gently on the shelf where it would live from now on, spine out, solid and permanent. They spent the rest of the afternoon organizing, Eliza directing and Reuben following her direction with good humor. And by the time the light was going golden through the 3 windows, all the books were shelved and the reading table had an oil lamp centered on it and 2 chairs drawn up to either side, and the little stone building beside Harrow Creek looked, for all the world, like a real library. "We need a catalog," Eliza said, standing in the middle of the room looking at the shelves with her hands on her hips, "so people can find what they're looking for. I'll make it by hand, title, author, shelf number." "That'll take you a long time," Reuben observed. "I don't mind things that take a long time," she said. "Good things usually do." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the shelves, and then he said very carefully, "Eliza." She turned. There was something in his expression that she had not seen on him before. The control was the same, but something beneath it was asking to be let through, like light through a cracked door. She waited. "I would like to call on you properly," he said, "if you're willing. I'm aware that my brothers have made their opinions known, and that the town talks, and that none of that recommends me as particularly good company, but I want to say it plainly, because you're someone who deserves plain speaking." He paused. "I want to court you, Eliza." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, a mockingbird was doing its evening inventory of every song it knew, and the creek made its constant soft sound through the trees, and the lantern in the new library cast warm light across the shelves full of books. "Your brothers think I read too many books," she said. "My brothers are wrong about a lot of things," he said, "this being one of them." She stepped toward him, and when she spoke her voice was warm and full and sure. "Then yes, Reuben Calloway, I am willing." The courtship of Reuben Calloway and Eliza Caldwell proceeded with a kind of natural momentum that surprised even them both, as if a river that had been finding its way around obstacles had finally reached the open plain and was simply, gladly, running. He came to the boarding house on Friday evenings and walked with her, and on Sundays he drove her in the ranch wagon after church, and they talked the way they had been talking since the beginning, easily, honestly, with genuine curiosity in both directions. He told her about a drive he'd done at 19, pushing cattle all the way from the hill country to Abilene, sleeping under the stars for 3 weeks and learning in a single long season exactly how vast the country was. She told him about reading Don Quixote at 15 and being moved to genuine philosophical crisis, because she could not determine whether it was a sad book or a funny one, and coming to believe that it was both simultaneously, which seemed to her profoundly true about life. He said that sounded about right. They disagreed about some things, which they both considered healthy. He thought the cattle trails were the lifeblood of Texas. She thought the cattle trails were churning up the land faster than anyone wanted to admit, which was actually a position supported by 3 of her books on American geography, and she lent him one of them. He read it in 2 weeks and came back and said, with the expression of a man who has found something uncomfortable and is being honest about it, "You may have a point." She found that so admirable she had to look away for a moment to collect herself. Hank confronted Reuben about it directly on a Tuesday morning, standing in the yard of the ranch house with his arms crossed, and his face set in the particular expression that meant he had been building up to something and was now committed. "You're serious about this?" Hank said. "Yes," Reuben said, adjusting the cinch on his saddle without looking up. "She's a schoolteacher. She has no property, no family here, no connection. She reads novels like they're food. Novels are food, Reuben said, and then looked up to make sure Hank had registered that he was serious. For the mind. Eliza explained it to me, and she's correct. He went back to the cinch. And she has more practical sense than you've given her credit for. She runs that school on almost nothing, and the children are learning, even the Greer boys who everyone had given up on. Hank was quiet for a moment. I don't want to see you make a mistake, Reuben straightened and looked at his older brother and said something he had been thinking for several weeks. Hank, I know you have a picture in your head of what my life should look like. A rancher's wife who keeps the house and doesn't cause talk. I respect that you have that picture. But Eliza is better than that picture, and I'm asking you to trust me when I say I know the difference. Something shifted in Hank's face, not agreement exactly, but something like the beginning of it. The library, Hank said gruffly. The library, Reuben confirmed. That building's been sitting empty for 8 years. And now it's full of books and children come to it on Saturday mornings. He said it simply, as a statement of fact. The first Saturday morning that Eliza had opened the Harrow Creek Library. That was what she'd written over the door in careful painted letters. The Harrow Creek Library, 6 children had appeared at 9 o'clock in the morning. And by noon there had been 11, and 2 of their mothers had come in and sat down and read with them, and me Briggs had sent over a tin of molasses cookies, which was as close as me got to making an official pronouncement that something was a good idea. Hank uncrossed his arms. It was a small gesture, but on Hank Calloway it was substantial. Just don't let it interfere with the spring muster, he said, which was Hank's way of saying he'd stopped objecting and walked back to the house. Boyd took longer, as Boyd always did with anything requiring a change of opinion. He was stubborn in the way that people are stubborn when they've committed to a position publicly and find the backing down embarrassing. But Boyd was also, underneath the bluster, not a cruel man, and the thing that eventually reached him was not an argument. It was a Saturday morning in June, when he rode past the stone library building on his way down to check the south water trough, and saw, through the open door, Eliza reading aloud to a semicircle of 7 children sitting on the floor around her chair. She was reading from a book of natural history, and she was doing the voices of the different animals described, and the children, some of whom Boyd had known since they were born, and considered generally beyond the reach of educational improvement, were sitting perfectly still with their eyes wide, and their mouths slightly open in the particular helpless absorption of children hearing a good story. He did not stop writing. But he turned it over in his mind for the rest of the morning, the image of those children sitting still with their eyes wide, and by the time he came back in the early afternoon, he made a decision that cost him something in pride but very little in honesty. He pulled up his horse in front of the library. Eliza was outside, sweeping the stone step, and she looked up at him without any particular expression. She had always been courteous to Boyd, but she was not a woman who pretended things were easier than they were. "Miss Caldwell," he said, hat in his hands. "Mr. Calloway," she said. He cleared his throat. I might not have been entirely fair in my thinking about the books, and such." Eliza looked at him steadily, and he had the sudden uncomfortable sensation of being seen more clearly than he was comfortable with. "Might not have been," she said gently. He sighed. "Wasn't," he said. "I wasn't fair." She set the broom against the wall and extended her hand the same way she had extended it to Reuben the first time they met, direct and warm and without ceremony. "Apology accepted, Mr. Calloway," she said, "and you're welcome to borrow a book any time." Boyd shook her hand with the expression of a man who has eaten something unexpectedly good and is not quite sure what to make of it, and rode on, and Eliza went back to her sweeping with the small private smile of a woman who has won something without requiring anyone to lose. The summer moved like the creek, steadily, warmly, with purpose. The library gained 30 more books through a school supply company in Dallas that Eliza had written to, explaining her situation in terms that were apparently persuasive enough that they donated a box of books meant for rural schoolhouses. She sent a letter of effusive thanks and then wrote to 4 other similar organizations, and by July had received books from 2 of them. She kept a careful ledger of every book in the collection: title, author, donor, condition, shelf number, in a leather-bound account book that Reuben had given her for the purpose, and she cross-referenced it with a hand-written card catalog she made from squares of stiff paper. Reuben came by the library on weekday evenings when the day's work was done, and they sat at the cedar reading table in the lamplight and talked, or read in companionable silence, or she would read to him from whatever book she was in the middle of, and he would listen with the particular quality of attention he gave to things he genuinely found interesting, which she came to recognize as one of the most meaningful things about him, that his attention was not polite but real. He had started reading more deliberately, working through the library's collection in a way that was systematic without being joyless. He read the history books first because they connected most directly to the world he knew. Then he moved on to the natural philosophy, and then, with some initial resistance that dissolved within the first chapter, to fiction. He read Jane Austen with an expression that started out skeptical and ended up deeply engaged, which Eliza found wonderful to witness. "She's writing about money," he said one evening, looking up from the novel with the focused look he got when he'd been thinking about something. "Underneath all the drawing rooms and the visiting, she's writing about what happens to people who don't have any." "Yes," Eliza said, setting down her own book. "Your father read her," he said. It was a statement. Her father's name was on the inside cover of the volume he was reading. "He loved her," Eliza said. "He said she was the most honest writer he'd ever read, because she never pretended the material facts of life didn't matter while she wrote about the things that mattered more." Reuben was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "He sounds like he was a good teacher." "He was a good everything," she said, and there was an ache in it that was also love, and Reuben heard both. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, briefly, once, and then went back to his book. It was at the end of August, on a Sunday evening after they had sat for 2 hours at the reading table talking about a book of American history that had generated strong feelings in both of them regarding the treatment of the Plains tribes. Eliza felt that the injustices were catastrophic and insufficiently acknowledged, and Reuben agreed, having seen enough of the aftermath as a rancher to have no illusions about it. And they were both frustrated in the same direction and had the heated, earnest conversation of 2 people who agree but need to say it aloud, that Reuben walked her back to the boarding house and stopped on the porch step and looked at her in the warm August dark and said, "Eliza, I love you." He said it the way he said everything important, plainly, directly, without ornamentation, as a simple statement of a thing that was true. She looked at him for a moment with the book of American history still under her arm and her hair loose from its pins and her brown eyes full and steady. "I love you too," she said, with the same plain directness, and then added, "I've loved you for a long time. Since the evening you walked me to the library the first time, if I'm honest. Possibly before." He stepped up to the porch where she was standing so they were level, and he took the book of American history out from under her arm and set it on the porch railing, and he kissed her carefully first, then less carefully, the way a river goes over a fall, and she kissed him back with the same wholehearted commitment she brought to everything. He proposed 3 weeks later in the library, which was the only location that made any sense. He had thought about proposing in some dramatic natural setting. There was a ridge above the creek that had a view that would have done credit to any moment. But when he thought about it honestly, the library was the right place because it was the thing that had begun them, that had made her look at him as a person rather than just one of the Calloway brothers, and because she loved it as much as he had hoped she would. He proposed with a ring that had been his mother's, a small gold band with a chip of turquoise that his father had bought in New Mexico on a cattle drive years ago and brought home as a gift, and his mother had worn it every day of her life until she died. He had kept it in the lining of his good boots for 2 months while he worked up the certainty he already had, which was really just working up the courage to speak it. He did not go down on one knee, because the library floor was newly swept, and it seemed unnecessary. He stood in front of her at the reading table and said, "Eliza, I want to marry you. I want to spend my life talking to you and building things for you and reading the books you hand me and hearing what you think about everything. I want to watch you teach and see your face when a new box of books arrives and hear you read aloud until we're both old. Will you marry me?" She looked at the ring in his open hand and then at him, and her expression was the particular expression that is the opposite of uncertainty, not the absence of feeling but the full presence of it. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." He put the ring on her finger and she looked at it for a moment, the small turquoise stone catching the lamplight, and then she looked up at him and said, "Your mother wore this." "Every day," he said. She turned her hand so the ring caught the light again. "Then I will too," she said. They were married in October of 1878, in the church on the east side of Harrow Creek, which was full to the back pews in the way that a small-town church only gets full when something has captured the community's imagination. The Reverend Miles performed the ceremony with the straightforward dignity he brought to most things, and Eliza wore a dress of deep blue wool that Me Briggs had helped her make, and Reuben wore his good boots and his church coat, and a look of steady, unguarded happiness that his brothers had never seen on him before. Boyd, standing as groomsman, looked at his brother's face during the ceremony and had the distinct and humbling experience of realizing that he had been entirely wrong about something that mattered, and that being wrong about it had not cost him anything except a few months of unnecessary skepticism. He resolved, privately and without fanfare, to be less wrong going forward. Hank sat in the front pew with Clara beside him, and when Eliza said her vows clearly, without rushing, as if each word were a thing she had decided in advance and was choosing again now, Hank had an expression that he would have described as dust in his eyes if anyone had been impertinent enough to ask. The reception was held in the library, because the church hall was too small and the saloon was inappropriate, and because Eliza had pointed out that the library was large enough for dancing if they moved the reading table to the side and rolled up the rag rug she'd put down in the center aisle. Me Briggs provided 3 kinds of cake. The Greer boys, who had become devoted library patrons and somewhat improved students, played fiddle and mouth harp with an energy that had the whole town on their feet by sunset. Even Amos Greer danced, twice, which was 2 more times than anyone had expected. Eliza danced with Reuben in the middle of the library they had built together, surrounded by shelves of books and lamplight and the whole of Harrow Creek, and she thought about her father, who would have loved this, who would have walked her down the aisle and laughed at the fiddle music and quoted something appropriate from Tennyson, and she said a quiet thank you to him that was not sad but full. Reuben, who was a competent rather than elegant dancer but who gave it the same steady attention he gave everything, leaned down and said, "Are you all right?" "I'm wonderful," she said, and meant it completely. They settled into married life with the ease of 2 people who have already done a great deal of the work of knowing each other before they made it official. Eliza kept her teaching position. There had been a brief and somewhat ill-tempered debate at the town council about whether a married woman should continue to teach, which Eliza had attended in person and addressed in a speech that was so thoroughly reasonable and so calmly delivered that Amos Greer had finally said that he supposed the children did seem to be learning more, which was technically all anyone could ask for, and the matter was settled. She moved into the ranch house, which was large and had been somewhat gloomy in the way of houses that haven't had a woman's organization applied to them in a long time, and she brought her remaining books and her father's boxes, and a determined approach to rearranging the sitting room that resulted in Hank standing in the doorway one morning looking at the new arrangement of furniture with an expression of mild bewilderment that she interpreted correctly as adjustment. "You've moved the chairs," he said. "They face the window now," she said pleasantly. "Much better light." He considered this for a moment and then said, "Clara's been saying that for years," which was the closest thing to a compliment she was going to get from Hank Calloway, and she accepted it with grace. She kept the library open on Saturday mornings from 9 until noon, and the attendance grew steadily through the autumn as the novelty of it spread to neighboring farms and ranches. Families came in from 5 miles out to borrow books for the week, and Eliza kept meticulous borrowing records in her leather ledger, and not a single book was lost, which she considered a genuine miracle, and which Reuben considered a predictable outcome given how carefully she had explained her borrowing policy to every patron. She also wrote to the Texas State Education Authority in Austin, proposing a formal rural library program that would allow small towns like Harrow Creek to receive periodic book donations from the state. She received a politely non-committal reply and wrote again, more forcefully. She received another politely non-committal reply and wrote to 3 state legislators directly, including one she found quoted in a newspaper saying that education was the foundation of a civilized society, which she quoted back to him at length and suggested that civilized societies generally had access to books. That letter received a response within a month. Reuben read her correspondence at the kitchen table in the evenings. When she would sometimes read him letters, she was composing to get his sense of how they sounded, and he was consistently impressed by the precision and force of her writing, which managed to be both entirely polite and completely implacable. "You never lose your temper in these letters," he said one evening. "That would give them an excuse to dismiss me," she said, adding a final sentence to her current draft. "A woman who is angry can be ignored. A woman who is scrupulously reasonable and absolutely correct is much harder to deal with." He looked at her with the particular look that meant he was filing something away. "That's a useful thing to know," he said. "You are already scrupulously reasonable," she said. "I've always found that admirable about you." She looked up at him over her draft. "Even before I loved you." He felt, as he often did when she said things like this, the particular warmth of being known and found worthwhile by someone whose judgment you deeply respected, and he thought that this was probably the most important kind of love there was. Winter came over the hill country in its gradual, decisive way, and the ranch work shifted to the rhythms of the cold season, the tending of the livestock through the cold nights and the repair work, and the accounting that the slower pace of winter allowed. Reuben spent the long evenings reading, and it became their habit to sit by the fire in the sitting room after supper. The chairs now facing the window, which during the day gave good reading light, and in the evening framed the winter stars and read in companionable silence, or talk, or Eliza would read aloud from whatever she was in the middle of. She read to him through the whole of that winter history, natural philosophy, a lengthy book about geological formations that he found genuinely riveting, because it put a name and context to formations he had seen on cattle drives, 2 novels that he found moving in ways he had not expected, and a collection of letters written by Abraham Lincoln that they both read and discussed with the intensity of people who understand that history is not finished with its argument. In February, she told him she was pregnant. He was in the barn, checking on a mare that had been off her feed, and she had come out to find him rather than waiting, because she was not a woman who was good at waiting with significant information. She stood in the barn doorway with her coat buttoned to the collar and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and told him plainly, and he straightened up slowly from the mare's stall and looked at her with an expression that went through several things in quick succession before settling into something that was very close to awe. He crossed the barn in 4 strides and put his hands on either side of her face carefully, as if she might be something that could slip away, and said, "Are you well?" "Perfectly well," she said, pleased and a little overwhelmed and very certain about it. He kissed her forehead and then her mouth and then pulled her against him in the cold barn with the mare shifting gently in her stall, and held her for a long moment without saying anything because there was nothing to say that wasn't in the holding. "We should tell the family," she said finally against his coat. "Yes," he said, and did not let go immediately. They told Hank and Boyd at supper, and Hank sat very still for a moment and then said, in a voice that was considerably thicker than his usual voice, he would have been pleased. Which was, for Hank, a large and generous thing to say, and Eliza reached across the table and pressed his hand briefly, and he allowed it. Boyd said finally, and then, when everyone looked at him, amended it to, "I mean, congratulations," and then grinned in the unguarded way he had that made him, in those moments, look very young. The spring brought the arrival of a response from the Texas Education Authority that was no longer noncommittal. It was, in fact, an official letter of recognition for the Harrow Creek Library as a model rural lending institution, along with a grant of $200 for book acquisition, and a promise of annual donations from the state fund that Eliza had essentially bullied into existence through 8 months of relentless, polite, irrefutable correspondence. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then sat quietly for a moment. "Reuben," she said. He looked up from his account book. "We're getting $200 for books," she said. He put down his pen. $200, and annual donations. He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression of deep, genuine admiration. "You did that," he said. "We did that," she said. "You built it. I just wrote a great many letters." "You wrote those letters the way I manage a cattle drive," he said. "Methodically, precisely. You knew exactly where you were going." She smiled at him, the real one, the one that started in her eyes. "I did know where I was going," she said. "I generally do." "I know," he said. And there was love in it the way there is love in things said by someone who knows you completely and is glad of what they know. They spent a full Saturday afternoon making a list of what books to acquire with the $200, sitting at the cedar reading table in the library, with the May sun coming through all 3 windows and making bright squares on the floor. And the argument about which titles to prioritize was one of the most enjoyable arguments of either of their lives, which was saying something because they had both found most of their arguments enjoyable. He pushed for more natural science and geography, because he had seen how those books captured the attention of the ranch children who were going to inherit the land. She pushed for more fiction and poetry because she believed, and had evidence, that imagination was a practical capacity that made people better at everything else. They compromised in the way they always compromised, which was not by splitting the difference, but by listening to each other carefully enough to end up with something better than either original position. The Harrow Creek Library received its $200 worth of books in July, packed in 4 large crates that arrived on the supply wagon, and the unpacking of them was a community event that nobody had officially organized, but everybody attended. Mee Briggs came with her granddaughter. The Greer boys came and were actually helpful. Clara came and sat at the reading table and opened a book of poetry with the satisfaction of a woman who had always wanted more access to poetry and had finally gotten it. Boyd came and browsed the shelves with the studied casualness of a man who does not want it known that he has developed an interest in books, but has absolutely developed an interest in books. He had borrowed 3 in the past month and been surprisingly tight-lipped about their contents. Hank came last, walking slowly around the perimeter of the building, with his hands clasped behind his back in the way he walked when he was being thoughtful. He stopped in front of a section of the shelves and tilted his head to read the spines, and then he picked one out, a thick volume on cattle ranching and range management by a Texas rancher named John Dunn, and turned it over to read the back. "Can I borrow this?" he asked. "That's what it's here for," Eliza said, and wrote his name in the ledger with the same neat handwriting she used for every entry. And Hank Calloway walked out of the library with a book under his arm and a very subtle adjustment in his expression that was the outward sign of an inward reckoning. Their son was born in August of 1879, on a warm night with the creek audible through the open window, and he arrived in the world with the frank vocal opinion about it that many newborns express, and Reuben sat beside Eliza in the aftermath when she was exhausted and extraordinary, and held the small, furious, perfect weight of his son, and felt the kind of feeling that does not have language adequate to it, the kind that lives in the chest and the hands. "Thomas," Eliza said. She had said the name weeks ago, and he had agreed immediately, and they had not considered another. Thomas Gerald Calloway, the first name Reuben's choice, the middle name hers for her father. "Thomas," Reuben said, looking at the baby, who had calmed and was looking back at him with unfocused, wondering eyes. "Hello." Doc Hennessy, washing his hands at the basin, said that mother and child were both in excellent health, which Reuben already knew from looking at Eliza, who had the look of someone who has done something very hard and is deeply glad of it. Hank held the baby that evening and was changed by it, visibly and permanently, in the way that uncles sometimes are. Boyd held the baby and announced that Thomas had the Calloway jaw, which was probably wishful thinking at this stage, but was also Boyd's way of saying he loved him. Clara made a celebratory supper that nobody ate much of because they were all too full of the evening to be hungry. Eliza nursed Thomas by the window in the sitting room later that night, with the stars very bright over the Texas landscape, and Reuben sat nearby and read to her quietly from a book of poems she had left on the side table, because she had asked him to, and because reading to her when she needed it was one of the things he had decided long ago was part of who he was now. He read Tennyson because it was there, and because her father had loved it, and the words moved through the quiet room like the creek moved outside steadily, carrying something. Thomas grew the way children grow when they are loved consistently, and fed well and surrounded by books, quickly, and with great enthusiasm about everything. By the time he was 2, he had strong opinions about which books he wanted looked at, and by 3, he was sitting at the library reading table on Saturday mornings with the older children, and listening to his mother read with the same complete absorption that those first 7 children had showed. He could not yet read himself, but he held the books with the reverence that he had observed in the adults around him, and considered them deeply important objects. Reuben built him a small shelf in the corner of the library reading room, the same height as a 2-year-old, and stocked it with picture books that had come in a donation from an Austin church school. It was the first shelf in the library built to child height, and it was used immediately and constantly, and Eliza looked at it the first morning it was there, and then looked at Reuben and said, "You keep building things," in a voice that held everything she felt about him distilled into 4 words. "You keep needing things," he said, equally simply, and that was that. The year 1880 brought a dry summer and a difficult cattle market, and the kind of ranching hardship that western Texas delivered periodically as a reminder that the land held no permanent promises. The Calloway ranch weathered it, as it had weathered other hard years, through careful management and the mutual support of a family that knew how to work. Reuben spent long days in the saddle and long evenings at the account books, and the library became, in that hard year, more important rather than less. The families who came in on Saturday mornings were often tired and strained by the drought, and an hour in the cool stone building with a good book was a kind of restoration that was not nothing. Eliza was pregnant again that autumn, and announced it with the same direct calm she brought to everything. And when the spring of 1881 brought rain and better prospects, and a healthy daughter born in April rose, for no particular reason except that Eliza had always loved the word, and Reuben said it suited her as soon as he saw her. The family felt complete in the way that particular configurations of people sometimes feel exactly right. Thomas, nearly 2, regarded his sister with a scientist's suspicion that softened into protectiveness within about a week. Hank made a rocking chair. Boyd, in a move that surprised absolutely everyone including himself, painted the nursery ceiling blue with white clouds, which he did on a Saturday when nobody was watching, and which he explained when asked, by saying that someone ought to have done it and he'd had some paint. The library continued to grow. By 1882, The collection numbered over 400 volumes. The Saturday morning sessions had become a genuine Harrow Creek institution, and Eliza had begun a small evening reading group for the adults of the town that met on Wednesday nights and discussed whatever book had been selected that month. The membership of the reading group was eclectic. Me Briggs, Clara, 3 ranchers' wives, Reverend Miles, Doc Hennessy, and eventually, with the low-key determination of a man who has decided something and is not going to announce it, Boyd Calloway, who showed up on the 4th Wednesday and sat in the back and said very little and came back the following week. Reuben attended when he could, which was not every week, but when he did he contributed to the discussion with the thoughtful precision that was characteristic of him. And Eliza always found that the conversation went somewhere more interesting after he spoke. The reading group, in the spring of 1882, read a long historical novel about the French Revolution that provoked significant disagreement among the members about the nature of justice, and whether violent change was ever justified when peaceful change was being denied. And the Wednesday night discussion ran 3 hours past its usual end time, and had to be concluded not because anyone was finished, but because Me Briggs had to get up at 4 in the morning to receive a supply delivery. "That's the best meeting we've had," Boyd said, walking out to the horses with Reuben afterward, under a sky so full of stars it looked almost crowded. "It was a good book," Reuben said. "I didn't think it would be," Boyd said. "A French book about a revolution. I thought it would be, I don't know what I thought." "You thought it would be the kind of thing someone like Eliza reads," Reuben said without accusation. Boyd was quiet for a moment. "I was an idiot," he said. "Not permanently," Reuben said. "That's the thing about being an idiot, it's not a permanent state." Boyd looked at him. "Is that from a book?" "No," Reuben said. "That's mine." Boyd laughed, a real, uncomplicated laugh, and they rode home together under the enormous Texas stars. By 1883, the Harrow Creek Library had become known in 3 counties as a resource, and Eliza had begun to correspond with other small-town schoolteachers across Texas, sharing her model for rural library establishment, which she had written up in a 12-page document titled A Guide for Rural Library Organization, written in the same clear, practical language she used for everything. She sent it to anyone who asked, and several people who hadn't thought to but she believed needed to. She also received, that year, a letter from the Texas Women's Education Society in Austin, inviting her to speak at their annual convention about her work in Harrow Creek. She read the letter at the breakfast table and then put it down and looked across at Reuben, who was drinking his coffee and watching her face. "They want me to speak in Austin," she said. "I know," he said. "I can see you want to say yes." "It's a 2-day journey," she said. "Thomas is 3 and Rose is 2. Thomas and Rose will be here with me and Clara and 2 uncles who dote on them excessively," he said. "Go to Austin, Eliza." She looked at him for a moment with the full weight of gratitude that is possible between people who genuinely see each other. "You never make me choose," she said softly. "Between your work and your family," he said. "No. That's not a choice that should have to be made." She reached across the table and took his hand. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said, with the quiet certainty of a man who does know it fully and without doubt. "Go to Austin. Tell them what you've built." She went to Austin in October of 1883 on the stagecoach with her guide for rural library organization in her bag and the plain blue dress she wore when she wanted to be taken seriously. She spoke to the Texas Women's Education Society for 40 minutes about the Harrow Creek Library and the children who came to it, and the families who drove 5 miles in bad weather to borrow a book, because having something to read mattered in ways that were hard to quantify, but easy to see if you were paying attention. She spoke about her father, and about the books he had left behind, and about a rancher who had built shelves because he believed she was right. She received a standing ovation, which she accepted with a nod and a slight color in her cheeks that she would not have admitted to. She also received, in the conversations afterward, a connection to a book distribution network that operated out of Houston and was looking for partner libraries in rural Texas. which was exactly what she needed, and exactly the kind of thing that would not have happened if she had not gone. She came home on the fourth day with a collection of business cards and a head full of plans and a gift for Thomas, and Rose from a bookshop in Austin. A picture book of animals for Rose and a beautifully illustrated book of maps for Thomas, who had begun to show, at 3 years old, his father's interest in geography. Reuben was on the porch when the wagon came back from town, and he came down the steps as she got down, and he took her bag and said, "How was it?" "Wonderful," she said. "I have so much to tell you." "Come inside," he said. "Supper's ready. Thomas has been waiting to show you a drawing he made of a horse, and I need to warn you it looks more like a table, but he's very proud of it." She laughed and took his hand, and they went inside together, to the supper table, and the children, and the warm lamplit kitchen, and the whole particular life they had built in the 5 years since she had walked into Harrow Creek with 3 books under her arm. The years that followed moved in the way that good years do, full of ordinary days that only seem ordinary until you look at them from the right distance and see that they were extraordinary all along. The library grew. The children grew. The ranch had its good years and its hard ones, and the family met them in the same way together, with honesty and work and the particular resilience of people who know their ground. Thomas, at 5, learned to read and did so with the unconstrained enthusiasm of a child who has been surrounded by books his whole life and has been waiting for this superpower. Rose, at 4, sat in his lap and demanded he read to her the way their mother read to them, with voices, and he obliged with varying levels of dramatic commitment that improved significantly when he realized it made her laugh. They fought sometimes, as siblings do, and were best friends in the way that siblings can be when they are raised with enough love and enough space and enough books to give them common ground. Reuben taught Thomas to ride at 4.5, walking alongside the pony with his hand steady on the halter, and the look on Thomas's face when the pony moved forward, and he moved with it, was one of the things Reuben intended to carry for the rest of his life. He taught Rose to ride at 4, and she was, if anything, less afraid than her brother, which meant that supervision was more demanding and also more entertaining. Boyd met a woman named Margaret Fay at the Wednesday reading group in 1884. She had moved to Harrow Creek from San Marcos to live with her aunt, and married her the following year after a courtship that was genuinely romantic in the abashed, determined way that Boyd did things he cared about. Margaret, who was 25 to Boyd's 30, and had strong opinions about everything, including the correct way to put up preserves and the correct interpretation of the French Revolution, was absolutely the right person for Boyd, and the reading group took full credit for the match. Hank did not marry. He remained the eldest Calloway brother, steady and reliable and somewhat solitary in the way he preferred, and he built a second bedroom onto the ranch house for Thomas when it became clear that the children needed more space, and he babysat on the Wednesday evenings when Eliza was running the reading group and Reuben was finishing late in the fields, and he was a consistent, gruff, deeply loving presence in Thomas and Rose's childhoods in the way that certain uncles are, who would never say the word loving but embody it entirely. Clara, who had worked in the ranch house since the elder Calloway's time, became something between employee and family member in the indefinable way that often happens when a person has been essential to a household for long enough, and Eliza treated her accordingly, and the two women had the kind of friendship that grows between women who respect each other's competence. In the fall of 1885, Eliza submitted her guide for rural library organization to a publisher in Dallas who produced educational materials, and it was published as a small book the following spring under the title Libraries for the Land, a practical guide for rural communities. She received 20 copies and sent them to 20 schoolteachers across Texas, and kept one on the shelf in the Harrow Creek Library between the natural science and the American history, which was where it clearly belonged. When the copies arrived, she brought one home and put it on the kitchen table and said nothing, Just let Reuben find it there when he came in from the fields. He came into the kitchen with his hat in his hand and saw it and stood very still for a moment. He picked it up and read the title and her name, Eliza Caldwell Calloway, it said on the cover, and he thought about the woman who had walked into the general store in 1878 with 3 books under her arm and changed everything that mattered about his life. And then he looked up at her and said, "Your father would have put this on every shelf he ever owned." She pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment. "Yes," she said, "he would have." "We'll put it in the library," Reuben said. "It's already there," she said. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her the way he kissed her when he meant more than words had room for, and she kissed him back. And Thomas, who was 6 and had come in from outside for water, observed this from the doorway with the philosophical resignation of a 6-year-old who has accepted that his parents are like this and there's nothing to be done about it. "Mama made a book," Thomas announced to Rose, who was 5 and came to look at the copy on the table with appropriate reverence. "I know," Rose said. "Mama makes lots of things. Books are different," Thomas said. "Why?" He thought about it for a moment with the intensity of a 6-year-old working through a real question. "Because they keep," he said. "Like the library. They keep." Eliza heard that from across the kitchen and looked at Reuben, and he was already looking at her, and the look between them carried everything that could not be said with Thomas and Rose right there. The gratitude and the love and the long, full, particular wonder of having built something that would keep, in a town on the edge of the Texas hill country that had once had no library, and now had one that would outlast them both. The Harrow Creek Library continued to stand through the coming years, through Texas heat and drought, and a spring flood in 1887 that rose close enough to the stone building that Reuben spent a long night with sandbags and several ranch hands keeping it at bay, and through the gradual changes that came to the hill country as the century moved toward its end. The cedar reading table remained, smooth and solid, with the oil lamp centered on it. The shelves remained, full and orderly, with Eliza's ledger updated every week in her careful handwriting. The card catalog expanded to 3 boxes of neat paper squares. The Saturday morning sessions remained, with new children arriving as the older ones grew and brought their younger siblings. Thomas started helping his mother run the Saturday sessions when he was 8, taking the role of reading aloud when she had other things to attend to, and he had her gift for it, the voices, the pace, the sense of when a listener needed to hear what came next. Rose, at 7, took charge of the shelving with the precision she applied to everything, and a look of serious satisfaction that was so completely her father's expression that it made Eliza smile every time. In 1888, Thomas was 9 years old and Rose was 7, and it was a mild spring evening when Reuben came home from a survey of the north pasture to find Eliza sitting on the porch with a letter in her hand, and an expression he could not immediately read. He sat down beside her and waited. "The Texas Education Authority," she said. "They want to name the library in their new report on rural education as a model institution. They're citing it as the first successful rural public library in the hill country." "That's what it is," he said. "They're also," she said, and her voice was careful, citing the rancher who built it, by name, as a community contributor of singular importance. She turned the letter over in her hands. "They want your permission to include your name." Reuben was quiet for a moment. He had never sought recognition for what he'd built. He had built it because it was right, because she was right, because there ought to have been a library in Harrow Creek and there wasn't one, and he had the land and the materials and the will to do it. That had always been sufficient reason. "Tell them yes," he said. She looked at him sidelong. "Are you sure?" "You've always avoided tell them yes," he said again, more gently. "It should be in the record, not because of me, because of what it became." He paused. "And because of you." She leaned against his shoulder in the evening warmth, and his arm came around her in the way it did, easy and certain, and they sat on the porch of the ranch house in the hill country in the spring of 1888 and looked at the land they knew and the sky above it, and Harrow Creek made its small, ordinary sounds in the middle distance. "I have been thinking," she said after a while. "I know," he said. "You have a thinking voice." She laughed. "Do I? A little quieter than your regular voice," he said. "And you go still. I was thinking about what Thomas said," she said. "When the book came, that things keep. What about it?" She was quiet for a moment, feeling the warmth of the evening and the solid warmth of him beside her, and the particular contentment that comes not from having everything figured out but from being deeply, specifically, irreversibly glad of where you are. "He was right," she said. "The good things keep, if you give them solid enough ground to stand on." He pressed his lips against the top of her head. "You gave them solid enough ground," he said. "We did," she said. The mockingbird in the live oak at the edge of the yard was going through its evening inventory, hitting every note it knew, and some it seemed to be inventing, and the stars were coming out over the hill country in their patient, enormous numbers, and in the stone building down by the creek, 467 books stood in their ordered rows on cedar shelves, waiting for whoever needed them next. Reuben and Eliza sat on the porch until the dark was full, and the children's voices had gone quiet inside, and Clara had put the lamps out in the kitchen. And they sat a while longer after that because neither of them was ready to end the evening, and because some evenings are worth sitting in until the very last of them is gone. "Come inside," she said at last, rising and extending her hand to him. He took it and rose and looked at her in the dark, the woman who had walked into his town with her books like armor and rebuilt the world around them both. And he thought, as he often thought, that he had somehow had the extraordinary luck to build the right thing at the right time for the right person, and that she had done the same in return, in every way that mattered. He followed her inside, into the warm lamplit house with his children sleeping down the hall and his brothers nearby, and his library standing solid by the creek, and he closed the door on the beautiful Texas night, and everything was exactly as it should be. Thomas Calloway grew to be a rancher and a reader both, which made his parents proud in equal measure. He knew the land the way his father did, and the books the way his mother did, and he brought those two things together with a natural integration that suggested they had never been opposed to begin with. He took over the management of a portion of the Calloway ranch at 18 with the same steady competence that was his father's inheritance, and he married a girl from a neighboring farm at 22, a capable, kind young woman named Eliza who had learned to read from the Harrow Creek library and thought there was nothing finer in the world, which Thomas considered an excellent qualification. Rose became a teacher, which surprised no one. She studied in San Antonio, staying with a family friend there, and came back to Harrow Creek in 1898 with a formal teaching certificate and the particular shining seriousness of someone who has been trained in a thing they were already born to do. She took over the schoolroom from her mother, who had taught for 20 years, and was ready to give more of her time to the library, and who handed over the position with the same warmth with which she handed over anything she loved. The library, by the end of the century, had over 700 volumes and a formal affiliation with the Texas State Library Commission, which Eliza had lobbied for with characteristic persistence over the previous 3 years. She and Reuben made a trip to Austin in 1899 to attend the signing of the affiliation agreement, which Reuben wore his good coat for, and Eliza wore a new dress in dark blue that Rose had helped her choose. And they stood in the state building and watched a document that contained the words Harrow Creek Library being signed by an official of the state of Texas. And Eliza pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth in the way she did when something was almost too much. And Reuben stood beside her with his hand warm against the small of her back. At the reception afterward, the commissioner said to Reuben, "I understand you built the library, Mr. Calloway." "My wife told me where to put the shelves," Reuben said. The commissioner laughed as if this were a joke. Eliza, standing beside him, did not correct the impression. She just looked at Reuben with all 21 years of knowing him in her eyes and thought that he was, as he had always been, the most precisely honest man she had ever met. They came home on the train. The railroad had come to the hill country in 1887, one of the changes that the end of the century had brought, and the Texas landscape rolled past the window in its changeless, instructive way. Dry golden grass and limestone outcroppings and live oaks clustered where water ran underground. And Reuben dozed lightly against the window, and Eliza looked at his profile in the afternoon light, the gray at his temples now, and the lines at the corners of his eyes, and felt the particular love that comes with long time and deep knowing, which is quieter than the beginning kind but so much larger. She took out her journal. She had kept one for years, as her father had kept one, as a record of the things worth recording, and wrote the date and where they were and what they had done. And then she wrote something else beneath it, a thing she had been thinking about since the commissioner's question. "He built it," she wrote, "and in building it he told me who he was, and that is the whole of the story, really. A man who builds something for someone else, not to be thanked, not to be admired, but because he could see that it was needed and wanted it to exist. That is the man I married. That is the man I will continue, for all the years I have, to love." She looked at what she'd written, and then she closed the journal and leaned her head against his shoulder and looked out at the Texas landscape going past in the golden afternoon. And she thought about her father's books on the cedar shelves by the creek, and her children's names in the library ledger, and the words over the door that she had painted herself in her careful hand, the Harrow Creek Library. And she felt, with a fullness that was almost physical, the particular rightness of a life that had gone the way it was supposed to. Reuben woke gently as the train slowed toward the Harrow Creek stop and looked down at her and said, "Almost home." "Almost home," she agreed and took his hand. The station platform was quiet in the late afternoon, and the buggy was waiting, and above the hill country the sky was that extraordinary deep blue that comes in the hour before sunset, and the creek would be glinting through the trees behind the stone building, where the books stood waiting in their rows, and everything was there as it always was, solid and certain, built on the particular ground of two people who had found each other in a small town and decided, without reservation, that this was the life they meant to live. Boyd Calloway, waiting for them at the station with the buggy and a somewhat self-conscious smile, said, "Well, is it official?" "Official," Reuben said. Boyd grinned his unguarded grin and slapped his brother on the shoulder. "I told Margaret it would be," he said. "She's made a cake." "What kind?" Eliza asked. "Peach," Boyd said. "From the tree out back. She says it's your favorite." "It is," Eliza said, and climbed up into the buggy with the warmth of the day and the warmth of everything else around her, all of it real and solid and keeping. They went home through the Golden Hill country afternoon, and the library stood as they passed it, the painted letters over the door visible in the low light, and Reuben looked at it as he always looked at it, with the quiet satisfaction of a man who built something that was needed and knew it had been needed. And Eliza saw him look and squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, and the buggy went on up the road toward home, where Margaret's cake was waiting and Rose was home from the schoolhouse and Thomas was coming in from the north pasture, and the day was closing perfectly, as the best days do, with everything accounted for and everyone loved and not a single thing left undone. The mockingbird in the live oak would start again at evening. The stars would come out enormous over the Texas sky. The creek would keep its sound through the night and past it, moving steadily over the limestone in the dark, the way things move when they know where they are going and are glad of the going. And in the stone building with the cedar shelves and the smooth reading table and the lamp centered on it, 467 books, soon to be more, would stand in their rows waiting for whoever came next with open hands and open eyes, the way good things wait, patiently and without condition, for the people who need them. That was Harrow Creek, Texas, 1899. That was the library beside the creek. That was the beginning of it, and the long good middle of it, and this, a man and a woman and two grown children, and an evening going golden over the hill country and a cake waiting at home, was the end of it, which was not an end at all, but the kind of place a story rests when everything it needed to say has been said, and said well, and the people in it are as happy as people can reasonably hope to be, which is very happy indeed.